After my dad passed away, I realized that he had truly left me with nothing but years of cold neglect. I am Chelsea, a woman who spent her entire life seeking a shred of affection from a man who never intended to give it. The funeral was an eerie, silent affair held under the gray skies of Ohio, where I stood completely alone among people who shared my blood, but not my heart. My brother waited until the last mourner had departed before he stood on the porch, with a triumphant, sickening smirk across his face. He clutched a suspicious document tightly in his hands, declaring with a loud, arrogant voice that our father had left every single asset to him alone. Without allowing me a moment to grieve, my brother grabbed my worn suitcase containing my few belongings before hurling it into the deep mud of the driveway. He snarled at me to leave the property, immediately claiming that I no longer had any right to step foot inside the only home I had ever known. A wave of suffocating bitterness washed over me because my father had closed his eyes forever without ever explaining his cruel, lifelong favoritism. I stood there shivering in the rain, watching the door slam shut on the life I once had, while wondering how much more I could possibly endure. Before we continue with the rest of this shocking discovery, please subscribe to the channel, plus leave a comment below. Your incredible support helps the channel grow while allowing me to share even more powerful stories with all of you. I wandered the empty streets of Cleveland with the little money left in my coat pocket, feeling the biting wind pierce through my thin layers as I realized I had nowhere to turn. The reality of my brother's cruelty settled into my chest like a cold stone, because I knew that Preston wouldn't hesitate to let me starve on the sidewalk. I spent hours scanning the classifieds on my phone until the battery finally died, leaving me to rely on the fading paper flyers posted on telephone poles. Every step away from the life I once knew felt like a betrayal of my own memories, yet I had to find a roof before the Ohio winter claimed what was left of my spirit. The shadows of the tall buildings seemed to stretch toward me like accusing fingers, mocking the fact that I had been cast out by the only family I had left. Eventually, I stumbled upon a lonesome wooden house at the end of a dead-end street, where a flickering yellow light cast long, distorted shadows across the overgrown yard. A handwritten sign in the window offered a room for rent at a price that seemed almost too good to be true, given my current financial desperation. When I knocked on the weathered door, an old woman with silver hair tied in a tight bun appeared behind the rusted screen. This was my new landlady, Viola, who didn't greet me with a smile, but instead studied my face with a piercing gaze that seemed to look right through my soul. I reached into my pocket to pull out the remaining cash I had managed to hide from Preston before he seized everything else during his frantic search of our family home. Viola took the money with trembling hands before she gestured for me to follow her into the dim, narrow hallway that smelled of cedar plus old books. She didn't ask for a background check or a security deposit, which felt like a miracle, even though the house seemed to be held together by nothing but hope plus ancient nails. The stairs groaned under our weight as she led me to a tiny room tucked away under the eaves of the attic where the ceiling sloped dangerously low. I watched her fumbling with a heavy brass key until she pushed open the door to reveal a space that was barely larger than a closet. The wallpaper was peeling in long, jaundiced strips, while a single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a harsh light over a thin mattress on the floor. I thanked Viola in a voice that was barely a whisper, but she simply turned away without a word, leaving me to face the crushing weight of my new reality. I dropped my suitcase onto the dusty floor before sitting on the edge of the bed, listening to the house settle as the wind began to howl outside the window. The silence in that room was far more deafening than the screaming matches I had endured with Preston earlier that day, because it signaled the end of my life as a daughter plus a sister. I realized that my father had died leaving me in the hands of a monster, so there was no one left in the world to protect me from the consequences of his favoritism. My heart felt like it was breaking all over again as I looked at the cracked ceiling, knowing that I was now truly alone for the first time in my life. As I moved to close the door for the night, I saw Viola standing at the end of the dark hallway, her figure silhouetted against the faint light from the kitchen below. She wasn't moving or making a sound, but she continued to watch me with an expression of intense curiosity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was something deeply unsettling about her presence, as if she were waiting for me to say something, or perhaps she were searching for a ghost in my features. Her eyes held a mixture of sorrow, plus a strange knowing recognition that made me feel like an intruder in a story I didn't yet understand. I eventually closed the door and locked it, but the memory of her haunting gaze stayed with me long after I had turned out the light. The next morning found me standing in the center of a kitchen that seemed to have absorbed decades of grease plus neglected dreams, while I tried to ignore the hollow ache in my stomach. I reached into my velvet pouch to retrieve the only item that connected me to a woman I had never known, which was a delicate gold necklace with a small crystal pendant. This piece of jewelry was the only thing my father Clifford hadn't managed to take away from me because I had kept it hidden in a secret lining of my coat for years. As I tried to wipe away a smudge of grime from the cold metal, my fingers slipped due to the lingering exhaustion, plus the emotional trauma of the previous day's events. The necklace fell with a sharp, dry clatter against the warped floorboards, echoing through the heavy silence of the house, like a sudden crack in a frozen lake. I hadn't heard anyone approaching yet. Viola was suddenly standing in the doorway with her eyes fixed on the floor, where the gold chain lay coiled like a sleeping serpent. Her breathing became shallow as she stepped into the small room, her gaze never wavering from the pendant, as if she were seeing a ghost from her own forgotten past. She didn't move to help me pick it up, but instead looked directly into my eyes with an expression that bordered on pure terror, combined with a strange sense of relief. The air in the kitchen grew heavy with an unspoken tension, while she stood there trembling, her hands clutching the edges of her apron until her knuckles turned white. "You were born on May 22nd, plus your mother passed away almost immediately after bringing you into this world, didn't she?" she asked with a voice that shook like dry leaves in an autumn wind. I stood frozen in place, my hand hovering inches above the floor, because there was no possible way this stranger could know such intimate details about my tragic arrival. How could you possibly know that specific date, since I have never mentioned it to anyone in this neighborhood? I asked, while my heart began to hammer against my ribs with a frantic, suffocating rhythm. The shock of her words felt like a physical blow to my chest, leaving me gasping for air in the cramped kitchen space as the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Viola slowly knelt down beside me, her old joints creaking as she reached out to gently touch the pendant with a reverence that made my skin tingle with an electric current. She looked at me with tears welling in her clouded eyes before explaining that she had been the one who placed that very necklace around my mother's neck during her final agonizing hours. "I was your nanny Chelsea, the woman who held you throughout your first year of life, until your father decided that my presence was a threat to his absolute control," she revealed with a bitterness that had clearly fermented over 2 decades of forced silence. She told me how Dad had abruptly fired her without a single word of recommendation, effectively banishing her from the only life she had known since my mother's passing. We sat at the small, wobbly kitchen table as she explained that she had ended up in this rundown house in Ohio because she had nowhere else to go after being cast out by the man I called my father. She had recognized the curve of my jaw, plus the shape of my eyes the moment I stepped onto her porch, yet she hadn't dared to speak until she saw the jewelry that confirmed her suspicions. Viola confessed that my mother had trusted her more than anyone else, often speaking of the fears she had regarding the coldness that was already growing in Clifford's heart. "I have waited over 20 years to see if the daughter of the woman I loved like a sister would ever find her way back to the truth," she said while clutching my hand with surprising strength. The realization that I had randomly rented a room from the very person who possessed the missing pieces of my childhood felt like a tectonic shift in the foundation of my reality. I began to understand that my brother's cruelty plus my father's lifelong silence were not just random acts of malice, but were actually the catalysts that drove me into the arms of the only ally I had left. The dusty kitchen no longer felt like a prison of poverty, but rather like a sacred ground where the lies of the past were finally beginning to crumble under the weight of the truth. I looked at Viola, seeing not a strange landlady, but a guardian who had been standing in the shadows of Ohio, waiting for the right moment to hand me the keys to my own history. More than 20 years have passed, yet Viola has preserved those secrets as a sacred vow of honor to my late mother. She sat across from me with a gaze that held the weight of decades, her voice dropping to a low plus steady rhythm as she began to describe the clandestine efforts my mother had made to ensure my survival. My mother had possessed a profound understanding of my father's narrow-minded nature, as well as his propensity to prioritize his own legacy over the genuine well-being of his children. Fearing that my father Clifford would one day leave me vulnerable to his cold whims or the reckless greed of Preston, she had taken desperate steps to secure my future through a hidden legal mechanism. She had worked tirelessly with a private attorney in another city to establish a protected trust fund at one of the most prestigious banks in Ohio, a fortress of wealth that remained entirely beyond the reach of my father's grasping hands. Viola recounted the day Dad finally discovered her involvement in these legal maneuvers, an act of defiance against his domestic authority that he could never truly forgive or forget. He had intercepted a letter from the bankers while Viola was returning from a secret meeting, his face turning a terrifying shade of crimson as he realized his own wife had outmaneuvered him within the very walls of his home. Because the trust was legally ironclad plus protected by a strictly defined set of conditions, Clifford had been unable to touch the money itself. Yet he took his petty revenge by severing the only link I had to my mother's protective spirit. Viola was dismissed within the hour without a single cent of severance, as well as a stern warning never to contact our family again, under the threat of severe legal consequences. I listened with a growing sense of nausea as I realized that the woman who had cared for me like her own daughter had been cast out into the world because she chose to protect my inheritance from a man who should have been my primary guardian. As the full weight of the truth began to sink into my mind, the sorrow I had felt since the funeral was rapidly replaced by a searing plus white-hot rage that burned through my veins like liquid fire. My father had allowed me to grow up feeling like an unwanted burden, forcing me to endure years of Preston's arrogance, plus constant financial hardship while a fortune waited for me just out of reach. Clifford had chosen to hide the truth out of pure spite, preferring to see me struggle in the shadows of his neglect, rather than admit that my mother had never truly trusted him with the future of her child. I rose from the rickety kitchen chair with a sudden burst of energy that startled even me, my hands trembling with the weight of this revelation, while my gaze hardened with a newfound sense of purpose. I am going to take back every single thing that he tried to steal from me, because my mother didn't build this fortress for it to be forgotten in the dust of his lies. I declared with a voice that was as cold as the Ohio winter. Preston thinks he has won everything by taking that house, but he has no idea that the real foundation of this family is about to collapse right on top of his greedy head. I added as I looked Viola directly in her tear-filled eyes with an intensity that signaled the end of my victimhood. I realized that my father's silence was a cage he had built for me, but Viola had just handed me the key to blow the locks off the doors for good. Viola nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment for over 20 years, reaching into the deep pocket of her apron to produce a small plus tarnished key that appeared to be older than the house itself. She led me to a heavy oak chest tucked beneath the window, kneeling down with great effort to unlock a false bottom that revealed a thick envelope made of yellowed plus brittle parchment. Within this envelope lay the original documents of the trust fund, the ink slightly faded, but the legal signatures remaining clear as well as undeniable in their authority over my destiny. These papers were the physical proof of my mother's love, a shield she had forged from the past to protect me in a future she would never live to see herself. I gripped the documents tightly against my chest, feeling the texture of the old paper beneath my fingertips as I prepared to step into the light, plus confront the brother who believed he had left me with nothing. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, I stood with Viola in front of the tall glass building of the Central Bank in Ohio, feeling the biting wind sweep across the plaza while I clutched the yellowed documents tightly against my chest. The sterile atmosphere of the private banking suite felt worlds away from the dusty attic I had occupied just hours before, yet the tension in my limbs remained as sharp as a jagged blade. We were ushered into a private office where a stern-faced officer began the grueling process of verifying my identity through a series of modern biometric scans that felt strangely invasive. I sat in a leather chair with my heart hammering against my ribs during the agonizing wait for the legacy system to process my DNA sample, as well as my fingerprints against the records my mother had established decades ago. Every second that ticked by on the wall clock felt like an eternity of judgment, leaving me to wonder if my father's influence had somehow reached even into this sanctuary of financial security. The silent computer monitor suddenly flickered to life with a soft chime that seemed to echo through the quiet room, signaling that the decades of hidden protection were finally being unlocked for me. My breath hitched in my throat when the final verification screen cleared to reveal a balance of $5 million, an astronomical sum that represented every ounce of my mother's foresight, plus her silent rebellion against Clifford. I felt a sudden rush of warmth spread through my cold veins because I finally realized that I was no longer the penniless outcast that Preston had tried to create on that muddy driveway. The figure on the screen was more than just money. It was the ultimate shield that my mother had forged from beyond the grave to ensure that her daughter would never be truly defeated. I looked over at Viola, whose eyes were brimming with tears of vindication, knowing that her 20 years of guarding this secret had finally culminated in this moment of absolute triumph. Just as we were preparing to finalize the transfer of the funds into a new private account, my phone vibrated in my pocket with an urgent call from my best friend Tara. I stepped toward the window to answer, feeling a cold dread settle in my stomach as I heard the frantic tone of her voice over the static of the line. Tara revealed the shocking news that Preston was already in advanced negotiations to sell our family home to a group of shady real estate developers to cover his mounting gambling debts. He had been seen meeting with high-stakes bookmakers at a local diner, desperately trying to liquidate our father's estate before the legal authorities or the creditors could intervene in his reckless spiral of self-destruction. The thought of those greedy strangers tearing down the only home I had ever known made my blood boil with a fierce plus protective rage that I hadn't felt since I was a small child. You need to stay close to that property and report every single person who enters or leaves that driveway until I can get my legal team in place. I told Tara with a sharpness that left no room for hesitation or doubt. She promised to keep a close watch from her car parked down the street, confirming that Preston seemed completely oblivious to the fact that I was currently standing in a bank with more wealth than he could ever imagine. I want you to document every conversation he has with those dealers, because I need enough evidence to bury his claims to that house once and for all. I added, while my mind began to lace together the intricate threads of a counterattack that would strike him where it hurt the most. Tara agreed to remain my eyes plus ears on the ground, pledging her absolute loyalty as she understood that the stakes had moved far beyond a simple family dispute. I turned back to the bank officer with a cold plus calculated expression, realizing that I possessed the financial firepower to turn Preston's own greed against him in a way he would never see coming. I instructed the bank to immediately put me in contact with a top-tier legal firm that specialized in anonymous acquisitions as well as debt management. My plan was to have a proxy company quietly buy up every single one of Preston's outstanding gambling debts from the casinos and the private lenders across Ohio. By becoming his primary creditor, I would be able to seize control of his financial destiny before he even had the chance to sign away the deed to our family home. The irony of the situation was not lost on me, because I was about to use my mother's love to buy back the very heritage that my brother plus my father had tried so hard to destroy. The next 2 weeks were a period of tireless work with my lawyer Grant, as we meticulously constructed a flawless strategy to reclaim the heritage that had been stolen from me in the wake of my father's passing. Grant spent several intense days identifying every single creditor who held a piece of Preston's reckless financial history, ranging from legitimate banking institutions to the darker underground gambling rings of Cleveland. We utilized a private limited liability company to mask my identity, allowing us to quietly offer cash buyouts for all of Preston's outstanding promissory notes plus his massive losses from illegal sports betting. My brother remained completely oblivious to these maneuvers because he was too busy boasting to his associates about the millions of dollars he expected to receive once the family home was sold to the highest bidder. He spent his nights in expensive clubs drinking top-shelf whiskey, as well as telling anyone who would listen that he had finally purged his life of his father's lingering influence, plus his sister's annoying presence. It was almost comical to witness his arrogance through the reports Tara sent me, knowing that his entire future was now resting in the palm of my hand without him ever suspecting a thing. While Preston was drifting further into his intoxicating dream of wealth, Grant plus I were busy gathering the forensic evidence necessary to prove that the signature on the will was a complete fabrication. We consulted with a top-tier handwriting expert who examined dozens of my father's old ledgers to confirm that Clifford could not have possibly signed that document during his final weekend hours. The expert pointed out that the slant of the letters plus the pressure of the pen were entirely inconsistent with the tremors my father had suffered from during his last few months of life. You are now legally positioned as the sole owner of every significant debt your brother has accumulated over the last 5 years, which effectively makes you his master. Grant explained while we reviewed the mountain of paperwork on his desk. I leaned back in my chair, plus looked at the evidence of Preston's greed, feeling a cold sense of satisfaction that the legal trap was now fully armed, plus ready to be triggered. The beauty of this plan is that we are using the very laws he tried to manipulate to ensure his absolute downfall, without ever having to raise our voices or engage in his petty drama. Grant added, before handing me the final assignment of debt documents for my signature. We discussed the legalities of the foreclosure process in the state of Ohio, ensuring that every step we took was beyond reproach so that Preston could have no hope of a successful appeal in the future. I spent the quiet evenings at Viola's house preparing myself for the confrontation that would take place during the court-ordered auction of our family property. I refused to let any emotion cloud my judgment, because I knew that Preston would try to use his usual tactics of intimidation, as well as verbal abuse, once he realized he had been outmaneuvered. I could almost hear my mother's voice encouraging me to stay strong, as well as focused on the justice that had been delayed for so many years due to my father's silence. We ensured that all our financial accounts were ready to outbid any other potential buyers, plus we made sure the sheriff's department was aware of the possible fraud charges involving the will. The silence I maintained throughout those 2 weeks was not a sign of weakness, but rather the quiet before the storm that would soon sweep away everything Preston had tried to steal from me. Every night I studied the auction procedures plus practiced remaining calm under pressure, because I wanted my brother to see the face of his ultimate defeat without me ever losing my dignity. Viola would often bring me a warm cup of tea, plus sit in silence with me, her presence a constant reminder of the woman who had sacrificed everything to ensure I would eventually have this opportunity. We had secured the necessary court orders to freeze any movement of the house proceeds, ensuring that Preston would not be able to flee with a single penny before his debts were fully satisfied through the legal system. My financial resources were now formidable enough to overwhelm any obstacle he might throw in my path. Yet I knew that the real victory would be watching the realization of his failure wash over him in a public setting. As the date of the auction approached, I felt a strange sense of peace, because I knew that the truth was finally on my side, plus the time for hiding in the shadows of my father's neglect was finally over. The house auction took place on a sweltering afternoon where Preston was laughing, plus talking smugly with potential partners, while leaning against the mahogany desk in the foyer. He was dressed in an expensive suit that he undoubtedly purchased with the funds he had pilfered from our father's estate during those final weeks of cold neglect. I watched from the entrance as he held a glass of champagne toasted his new business associates, while completely forgetting the sister he had left for dead in the Cleveland rain. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, as well as the greedy anticipation of investors who were eager to tear apart the legacy of my family. Preston looked every bit the successful heir he believed himself to be, unaware that the foundation of his fragile empire was about to be obliterated by the truth. I stepped through the heavy front doors, plus let the thick, humid air of Ohio settle around me before pausing to adjust my sunglasses as I surveyed the room of vultures. The moment I removed my glasses, plus locked eyes with my brother across the crowded hall, his smug expression vanished instantly to be replaced by a mask of pure shock combined with a flicker of primal fear. He stumbled back against the desk before pointing a trembling finger at me while screaming for the security guards to remove this trespasser from the property immediately. Preston's voice was high-pitched plus incredibly desperate, sounding exactly like a cornered animal who had just realized the hunter was standing right in front of him. He continued to yell incoherent insults as well as threats, yet his eyes betrayed the fact that he knew deep down his time was finally running out. I did not move even an inch as the security personnel approached with their hands on their belts. Nor did I show a single flicker of the intimidation that had once defined our relationship in this house. I am not here to beg for a place to stay, but I am standing here as your primary creditor plus the successful bidder for this entire estate, I said with a voice that cut through his frantic shouting like a sharpened blade of ice. My words seemed to echo off the high ceiling as the potential buyers plus the auctioneers turned their heads to witness the collapse of the man who had claimed to be the rightful heir. My words seemed to echo off the high ceiling, stripping away the illusion of Preston's authority, plus leaving him standing naked in the light of his own crimes. Grant stepped forward with a heavy briefcase containing the legal documents that proved every single cent of Preston's inheritance had been consumed by the massive debts I now owned. My lawyer began to methodically read the court orders that had authorized the seizure of all assets standing in Preston's name due to his total plus irreversible financial insolvency. He presented the evidence of the fraudulent will, showing the signatures that were clearly forged by my brother during the final hours of our father's life, while he was too weak to even hold a pen. The handwriting experts had been thorough, providing a mountain of evidence that made Preston's claims to the property look like a pathetic work of fiction designed by a greedy child. The legal weight of the documents was undeniable, effectively rendering every transaction Preston had made since the funeral completely null plus void under state law. Preston's face turned a ghastly shade of pale as he began to realize that his intoxicating dream of wealth was dissolving into a nightmare of criminal liability plus absolute poverty. He tried to lunge toward the documents in a fit of rage, but the security guards who were once his servants now held him back with a firm plus uncompromising grip on his shoulders. You are now facing felony charges for the forgery of our father's last will, plus testament, which means the state will be investigating every single transaction you have made since the funeral. Grant informed him while maintaining a cold plus professional demeanor that left no room for negotiation. My brother began to wail about how unfair this was, pleading with me to remember that we were family, as well as claiming that he was simply doing what was best for our father's legacy. His desperation was a pathetic sight, to behold a complete reversal of the arrogance he had displayed just minutes earlier when he thought he was untouchable. I looked at him with a gaze that held no warmth, plus absolutely no room for the manipulation he had used against me since we were children in this very house. My compassion ended the moment you decided to hurl my only belongings into the mud, plus leave me homeless in the Ohio winter without a single dollar to my name, I declared, while looking him directly in his hollow, desperate eyes. I reminded him that he had spent his entire life taking from those who loved him, but today, the ledger was finally being balanced in a way that he could never escape through lies or charm. There would be no reconciliation, plus no second chances, because I had finally learned the value of my own life through the suffering, plus the isolation he had inflicted upon me. The reality of his situation finally settled over him like a shroud of heavy iron, leaving him broken plus weeping on the floor of the foyer he had tried to claim as his private kingdom. 2 police officers arrived shortly after to take my brother into custody, their presence a stark reminder that the laws of man had finally caught up to his reckless plus illegal behavior. I watched as they placed the heavy metal handcuffs on his wrists, listening to the metallic click that signaled the end of his reign of terror over my life, plus my memories of our father. Preston was led out of the house in front of the very people he had tried to impress with his stolen wealth, his dignity stripped away along with the fortune he had never actually earned through honest work. I stood on the porch as the patrol car drove away into the shimmering heat of the afternoon, feeling the weight of the past finally lifting from my tired shoulders. The driveway where he had once abandoned me was now completely empty of his presence, leaving me with the peace, plus the freedom that I had fought so hard to reclaim for myself. 3 months have passed since the storms in my soul finally subsided, plus now I stand on the front porch watching the vibrant orange plus red leaves of the Ohio autumn drift slowly to the ground. The sound of hammers as well as saws echoes through the hallways of my childhood home, but this time the noise brings a sense of healing rather than the destruction Preston had intended for our family legacy. I have hired a local crew to strip away the years of neglect, plus the coldness my father had allowed to settle into these walls, replacing the dark wood with bright, welcoming colors that reflect the light of my new beginning. Every room is being meticulously restored to honor the memory of the mother I never knew, turning this house into a sanctuary of love plus truth, rather than a monument to favoritism as well as silence. I spent several weeks personally sorting through the attic to find any lingering traces of my mother's spirit, feeling her presence in every corner as I reclaim the space that was rightfully mine. The garden is being replanted with the same flowers she once loved, ensuring that the legacy she built with her secret trust fund will continue to bloom for generations to come in this small corner of Ohio. I have officially welcomed Viola into this home as a permanent member of my family, giving her the largest plus most comfortable suite on the second floor, where she can finally rest after 20 years of guarding my secrets. She spends her afternoons sitting by the large bay window with a cup of tea, her eyes shining with a sense of peace that only comes from seeing justice finally served for a woman she loved like a sister. We often talk about the future plus the many ways we can use our new resources to help others who have been marginalized or silenced by the greed of those who should have protected them. Viola has become the grandmotherly figure I never had during those long years of isolation, providing me with the emotional foundation that my father was too afraid or too stubborn to ever offer himself. The bond we share is not one of blood, but of shared sacrifice, as well as a commitment to the truth, a connection that feels far more real than the biological ties that Preston had so thoroughly betrayed. As for the man who once called himself my brother, Preston is now experiencing the harsh reality of the life he tried to impose on me that rainy night after the funeral, as he struggles to survive in a cramped city shelter. He has lost every asset he attempted to steal, and he is now facing a mountain of legal debt that he will likely spend the rest of his life trying to repay to the various creditors I control. With no legitimate skills and no one in the community willing to trust him, he has been forced to take on grueling manual labor jobs just to scrape by on the streets of Cleveland. I came to understand that my mother didn't just leave me money. She left me the strength to stand on my own 2 feet and taught me that the true value of family lies in sincerity and protection. Before we conclude today's powerful story, I want to invite you to stay for a moment, plus, reflect on the profound lessons that Chelsea's journey has revealed to all of us through this narrative. This tale serves as a sobering reminder that favoritism, as well as long-held secrets within a family, can create wounds that take decades to heal, yet justice has a way of finding its path when truth is involved. As the owner of this channel, I believe the most significant takeaway is that blood relations do not automatically grant someone the right to your loyalty, especially when they act with malice plus greed. We often feel obligated to forgive family members who hurt us, but Chelsea's decision to cut ties, plus protect her own peace, is a brave example of setting necessary boundaries in a toxic environment. I personally feel that Clifford's greatest mistake was not just his favoritism, but his cowardice in hiding the truth, which allowed a monster like Preston to flourish at the expense of his own daughter's well-being. Now I want to hear from you because your perspective is what makes this community so special, plus insightful for everyone involved in our shared journey. If you were in Chelsea's position, would you have been able to stay so calculated as well as patient during such a difficult time, or would you have handled the confrontation with Preston differently? Perhaps you believe she should have offered a small amount of mercy to her brother despite his cruelty. Or do you agree that his current homelessness is the only fair consequence for his betrayal? Please do not hesitate to share your opinions, plus your personal thoughts in the comments below, because I truly enjoy reading your unique takes on these complex family dramas. Thank you so much for listening until the very end of this story, as well as for supporting the channel as we continue to explore the depths of human resilience, plus the pursuit of justice. Your incredible engagement helps us grow, as well as allows us to bring more stories of triumph over adversity to your screens every single week.